introduce themselves in turn, and then we're just going to very informally have a conversation about these really important issues. And thank you for joining. So Judith, can I ask you to go first? Would you like to introduce yourself and just say something about your perspective on these?
Yeah, so I'm Judith Anderson. I'm chair currently of the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is an organisation that's been around for a number of years and is fast growing and developing in terms of what we are hoping to deliver. I think one of the ways Climate Psychology Alliance operates is not to get drawn into simplistic or binary ways of thinking about emotions connected to climate change or psychological factors connected to climate change. And one of the things I find myself thinking a lot about at the moment is how much grief plays a part in our reactions to the combined environmental, climate change and biodiversity crises, and how we navigate that grief, and stay hopeful in some ways. And I think that's all I want to say, Caroline, by way of introduction.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Sally, can I come to you?
Yes, hello everybody. It's very good to be here. My training originally was clinical psychology, and then I trained as a psychoanalyst. I have been a member of CPA, Climate Psychology Alliance, from its beginning, and with a long-term interest in climate psychology and how we understand what's happening, and our, in many cases, failure to grasp what's happening. And just recently, I've become chair of, there's a new climate committee which has been set up by the International Psychoanalytic Association, which I welcome actually, because it means, that the IPA, as we call it, recognizing the need to work in this area. So anyway, that's my introduction. When you talk about this subject, there are so many ways in. The subject is too big to talk about, as we all know, so we try and get little chunks of it. Just at the moment, I'm thinking about fragility. So I invite everyone to think of a parcel that comes through the post, and it's got a big sign that says fragile, handle with care. And the more I think about it, the more I think that the mind is resilient, but it's also got areas of fragility. We could spend the whole time just talking about fragility, but the mind needs handling with care as well. And so that's what I've been preoccupied with, because I think that we are living in a dominant culture at the moment. That's my focus of my writing right now, is the dominant culture that actually I call a culture of uncare. It doesn't help us, it doesn't support us to be able to tolerate and bear our fragility, meaning our recognition of our absolute dependency, our difficulties with facing emotional overload. That's another kind of fragility. And why did we ever think that people could just be treated as if they didn't need careful handling to manage the really difficult things in life, such as Judith has mentioned, the enormous weight of guilt. I think the enormous weight as well, because we don't talk about it enough, of mourning, and the enormous weight of guilt, which I don't think we talk enough about. It's very hard to process. So we're resilient, but we're also fragile. We need support. And so, given that we're not necessarily getting it from mainstream culture, we have to find ways ourselves of understanding and providing that support. So I think that would be to help us to process very difficult things. And, we say we need to face reality, but actually facing reality can get too hard, and then we can tip into illusion, or we can tip into fracturing our minds. in that sense, I think we're fragile and we need to be aware of that, and so always hold it in mind and handle with care. That's my introduction.
Thank you, Sally. So Judith and Sally have given us a beautiful introduction to this subject of grief and loss and guilt and mourning and the struggle of facing reality. Elouise, would you like to introduce yourself and speak a little bit about the subject?
Sure. So I'm Elouise, and I'm currently a master's student at the University of East Anglia, where I'm doing a project on the white storks that have been reintroduced back into the UK just a few years ago. And I would say that I was also a climate activist and has been one for maybe a bit over a year. And my route into that definitely came from a place of eco-anxiety and of guilt and of grief. I was learning about the environment and ecology at uni in my undergraduate, and just feeling odd every time I left a lecture where people are, oh, look at this amazing thing. Oh, wait, here's how you destroyed it. And just having that message again and again every single day for 3 years gets a bit much. And reading more about it, learning more about how the world was dying, essentially, and just feeling so lost and confused and like, why is this happening? We've known this for decades before I was born, and yet nothing has happened. And it becoming quite debilitating at points where you just don't want to connect anymore because it just becomes too overwhelming. And I figured out that by joining something like the UK Youth Climate Coalition, which is where I sort of organise events and campaigns now, that sense of community really helped me, but it's still something I have to keep in check. And that sort of, I've learned more about it from my relationship with Caroline, because I introduced her to speak at a conference we were hosting. And that was the first time I kind of knew there was a name for that kind of existential dread I was feeling, which was eco-anxiety. And that is sort of where I'd like to end really at the moment.
Thanks, Elouise. That was pre-COVID, that conference, but it was this time last year, right? It's a bit shocking, isn't it? Thank you. We've had a poetic, philosophical and practical start and talking about existential dread. I want to just say a few things talking about what you may have felt and questioning anybody who questions this, if you like, from the newspapers in September this year. So 14th of September, The Guardian, failure to hit biodiversity targets marks a lost decade for nature. So that was on the Monday. This was a tough week because on the Tuesday, made it to the front page, anxiety in the UK, cases have trebled in a decade. There's been an explosion, in inverted commas, in anxiety in Britain over the past decade, naming financial crash, austerity, Brexit, apologies, climate change and social media blamed for huge rises in the condition, specifically affecting 30% of young women aged 18 to 24, although the rise is across the board. This was a huge piece of research. They analysed 6.6 million people in nearly 800 GP practices. And then we got on to October, the 13th of October, 1 in 5 countries, ecosystems may collapse, and 29th of October, climate crisis threatens British wildlife's ability to adapt and survive. So it makes perfect sense, really, if you look at that, given that we kind of reflect and measure a lot of our mental health and well-being based on our capacity to respond to external reality. When you've got that frequent messaging about those complex external realities, which are genuinely threatening globally, then it would make perfect sense, wouldn't it, to feel rather anxious. So my research for the past 5 years through the University of Bath has been into how children and young people are feeling about the climate and biodiversity crisis. So alongside my work as a psychotherapist and work with Climate Psychology Alliance, I've also been speaking with young people in the Maldives, the United States of America, the UK, Brazil, Sweden and Nigeria and Bangladesh about how they feel. And what they've been telling me for more than 5 years is that they're very, very frightened. But what particularly makes young people and children afraid is adults' seemingly disconnection in terms of, and I'm generalizing, so I apologize, but adults like disconnect about this level of anxiety, and then the kind of projection, the tendency to sort of blame children around that, which is often embodied really. So I also want to just say a couple more things, and then I'm going to shut up and ask the panel to start to discuss some of these key points that have been raised. At the Climate Psychology Alliance Community Day recently, the Climate Psychology Alliance has this slogan, Facing Difficult Truths, which Sally's referred to. But Chris Robertson, one of the founders, said we thought that maybe we should start to think about changing that to ask the question, why people lie about the climate and biodiversity crisis, sort of indicating that it's considerably moved on. So if we put that alongside some of what I've just been saying about the meaning of those feelings of dread and anxiety and depression and despair, and the importance of the range of feelings, and rather than pathologize them, to really understand them and think that they actually make perfect sense, don't they? And to leave us with the question to think about a bit this afternoon, which is, can we move towards a culture of care through caring about the anxiety and the climate and biodiversity crisis? Is that perhaps one way towards a culture of care? That could we reframe eco-anxiety as eco-care or eco-awareness or eco-aliveness? Is there a way of bringing these feelings into the frame so that instead of either trying to push them away or do something with them, we could actually go deeper into them and they could show us a way to navigate some of this complexity? So that's all I'm going to say for the moment. What I'd like to do is to invite Judith and Sally to respond. Whoever would like to go first.
Sally?
Judith, I'm just wondering, have you got something to pick up on immediately?
I think I want to revisit what I said earlier, that about there are no simplistic solutions, I think, Caroline, to what you're saying. And anybody who thinks that there are kind of quite simple stages in navigating anxiety or grief or guilt is being a little bit wishful, is indulging in wishful thinking, because the way our psyches work isn't necessarily stepwise. We had a lot to be grateful for when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, for example, talked about the stages of grief. But the reality is that most of us jump between different stages and actually hold different positions in relation to grief or any emotion simultaneously. One of the ways we operate as human beings is to hold many different views and perspectives and emotions at the same time. Mm. And Caroline, one of the things I've really welcomed you speak about is holding on to the biodiversity of our emotions. Mm. That's a phrase that I'm thinking about quite a lot. And how we can almost, as it were, make our hearts big enough to be able to inhabit all those different emotions and keep going at the same time. Mm. Mm. Sally?
I very much agree, Judith, that and that's a lovely phrase, you know, that one of the problems with talking about eco-anxiety is that it implies that it's anxiety, but it's a lot more than anxiety. That's used to cover a wider range, you know, which includes actually feeling frankly traumatized by what's going on, feeling angry, feeling despair, feeling grief, feeling overwhelmed, you know, feeling it's all too much and so on. There's a whole gamut of feelings in there. But one of the things I think to hang on to is that to have those feelings is actually to be alive. If you don't have any of those feelings, you're cut off, you know. I think the problem is that we we can't find a balance between too much and too little, because the damage is so enormous. And struggling to stay with that is very tasking. And I think that we need a lot of support from our groups to be able to stay with it. Just one thing I'd like to say to you, Elouise, is that we went during this year to stay at the Nep estate, and I saw storks. I saw them nesting on the trees, and it was absolutely wonderful. And we feel these feelings because we care. You only grieve for something or someone that you love. Otherwise you're indifferent, so I think we need to make room for all these things, and also to recognize that to go back to that parcel image, sometimes it is actually too much to bear. I had a journalist who phoned me up who actually works for an environmental group who has to process all this as we do, and he said, I'm just completely overwhelmed. I can't bear it. How do you bear it? And I said, well, I get overwhelmed as well. He was quite surprised that I would just say that, and I said, of course we get overwhelmed, but it doesn't necessarily last. You dip into it and then you wake up the next morning and you carry on, or you get some support, or, but I don't think we should pretend this is easy. This is, it should never have got to this. I don't think that the human constitution and mind and heart is actually equipped for such problems, and we have to try and stay with them. I remember you and I, Caroline, having this conversation. We said, how can we bear it? And we said, we can't bear it. And then we said, well, we have to bear it, because if we don't bear it, we won't stay sane. And this is the edge that we're living up against, and what a way to be living. I just, one more thing I'd say is that just sticking with fragility and the difficulty, I think it's really crucial to treat ourselves as fragile and to look after ourselves, handle with care, like the parcel. For instance, I won't look at any environmental news in the morning if I'm going to be writing something. I never look at it before I go to bed, because I won't be able to sleep. And I think we have to manage ourselves as to what we can bear, when we can bear it, and get support from people, and remember that there are millions of us, and we all want the same things, more or less. Yeah.
Thank you, Sally. I'm going to come to you in a second, Elouise, but I just want to share something there. Sally, I love what you just said. And it reminds me, I bought a plant, a very unusual plant, and it was mailed through the post last year. And it had this huge sticker, handwritten sticker over the front that said, written all over it, fragile, handle with care or will snap. And I looked at this label and I thought, that's me. That's not just the plant, that's me. So I took the label and I stuck it on my fridge, and I kept it on my fridge for quite a long time. I thought, yeah, absolutely. I used to sob after every research interview with children in the Maldives, because it was so hard to bear what they were saying. But maybe it's about having to find ways to care, and maybe that's something we could talk about. So I'm going to leave you, Judith and Sally, with that thought for a minute. I'm going to come to Elouise about how can we start to find ways, because I really like the idea of not being sure how to do this, not knowing how to do this, but maybe having some creative exploration. Elouise, can I come to you and invite you into the conversation?
Like what you're saying about ways to cope and how to deal with it, I myself do not know. I'm just someone who knows how it feels, and so I go through it through trial and error, basically. For me, what I found was when I was feeling isolated, so either a bit lonely or just physically alone, it would be worse because you're sort of inside your own head more so, and that isolation doesn't help with the existential dread feeling. But by joining communities who also share the same feelings and are saying like the same feelings as well, and who care so deeply, but also struggle with the burden that it is to care so deeply, but also the fact that we're also quite proud in a way that we care so deeply. Because I think, Caroline, you introduced this to me. Before I would be like, oh, I need to stop crying about it. Like, I just need to get on and do things. And you're like, no, that's not good. The fact that you are getting upset or you're grieving indicates that you have a level of empathy and that you are caring about things which should be cared about. And that is a good thing, to have such a range of emotions and to be able to connect to stories happening on the other side of the world, and to want to do something to help that. And that notion definitely changed my perspective on the grief that I feel and the sadness I feel. Often you're told that you shouldn't be angry, you should be grateful, you shouldn't be sad, you should be happy. And that's not sustainable or healthy or allows you to experience the true biodiversity of feelings that you have. And so by having this community who share the same views that I do, and we can kind of support each other as well. And also it helps when we work out like campaigns or events. If one of us needs to tap out because they've got a bit overwhelmed, because it's got a bit much, it's almost easier to do so because you know that whatever project is going to keep going ahead without you there for a moment. And so it allows all of us to feel like we can step away. I used to feel like when I was kind of contemplating this all alone, that I couldn't stop, because if I stopped, then things wouldn't happen and we don't have time for that. But by being part of a group, I know I can rest. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And my friends will keep working and I'll come in and tap in, and someone else might tap out like, oh, I have a lot of uni work to do, or I'm really struggling to find a job, and all these other problems that young people are facing, particularly now more than ever. And having that support network really helps.
I want to come back to Judith and Sally in a second, but Elouise, can I just ask you a bit more about what you've just been saying about the depth of that feeling, and how sometimes, do you think that young people are feeling differently in some ways? Not in all ways, but is there something unique to the way that young people may be processing and understanding some of these multiple crises?
I think, well, I was born in 97, so I don't really remember a time when the internet wasn't a thing. And to be so connected from such a young age, to be able to hear stories from the other side of the world in real time that was immediately happening. And all of us grew up through that, and everyone younger than me has never known a world without phones and internet. And I mean, people can argue whether that's a good thing or bad thing, but one thing that it has allowed us to do is to be so globally connected with other young people on the other side of the world. And maybe that is in part, maybe that is leading to some of that eco-anxiety as well. Like, we're not just in our own bubbles anymore. We can see what is happening in the Maldives through the eyes of a young person there and relate to it. And maybe that is, again, it's not good or bad, it just is. We are so much more exposed, I think, and have grown up in a much more exposed world to all the problems it's facing, combined with the fact that we are running out of time, and that we know that these problems have been going on for decades and decades for any of us who are ever born, and it hasn't happened. And I think that all those things combined are sort of creating this positive feedback loop of eco-anxiety, because it's a mixture of betrayal from things not being sorted out before, to extreme connection and empathy for those who are suffering. Maybe those in high income countries such as the UK, maybe a feeling of guilt, knowing that our impact is by far the biggest, but also the impact of climate change on us might be far lesser than someone in, let's say, the Maldives as well. And I think all of that just creates a very eco-anxious bunch of people, and a generation who is struggling with that depth of feeling and is trying to use it to make changes.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this also connects back to what Sally was saying a minute ago about the edge, and about needing to find ways to bear this, and also maybe to find ways to imagine and understand if we're not feeling that personally directly, but to respect that may be how other young people in particular might be feeling it. Sally, can I come back to you and invite you back in?
You see, I think there's another. Thank you very much for what you've just said. It's very moving, Elouise, and to the point. I think there's another angle on the issue of bearing suffering, which is that and I think it applies particularly to the younger generation and also to people who are disproportionately bearing the effects of climate change right now, which is that, I think that we need to remember that there's also a mechanism at work, I think, which is, and it's part of this fracturing that happens, which is that other groups can bear the suffering. So that, there's a real problem in a conversation between a young person and a parent, for instance, or, where the young person is saying, listen, you heard it with Greta, listen. And what they meet is a deafness and an indifference. And somewhere, I think privilege is involved in that, because it's a kind of motivated deafness that says there's a word in psychoanalysis and therapy, which is project, locate, take something that belongs to you and put it somewhere else. We don't have to suffer. It's this other group that can suffer. Mm. We've seen it with Black Lives Matter. Mm. We've seen it with, misogyny. There is a group designated to bear the suffering. Mm. And I think it applies to the climate issue as well, that climate scientists, youth, people who really care, and there are millions of them who really do care. And I think we mustn't get into binaries about young and old people, but, those people can do the suffering. Mm. And we will be very sympathetic to them. We'll even talk to them and so on and so forth. But actually, when it comes to really making changes, that's where the rub comes in. We're not sure we're really willing to do that. So I think that the whole subject of eco-suffering, if you like, suffering about really seeing and feeling what's going on, has this dimension that we need to pay attention to. Mm.
Thank you, Sally. Do you want to add anything, Judith?
I think I want to think a little bit more in very direct terms about what Sally said earlier about self-care. Mm. And I think that old adage of, put your own oxygen mask on before you put somebody else's oxygen mask on is so important. This is an emergency. When we hear that word, biodiversity emergency, climate emergency, for those who care, whether it's a lot or a little, that stimulates us often into quite heroic action, or it can do. But actually, we've got to be doing this for the long haul if we're engaged in any way, whether we're engaged in personal acts or community actions or actions with our families or organizations or government. We're in it for the long haul, and we have to do it in a way that's sustainable. And I think that's really important. And in some way, just addressing one of the questions I'm spotting in the chat, if I may, Caroline, I think staying within our abilities and really respecting what our capacity is can help with managing cynicism. For me, I don't think it applies to everybody at all, but I guess it applies to some people. Times when I get cynical are often when I'm overtired or exhausted, or I've watched too much stuff late at night. And then cynicism is a good place to go. It's a good blanket. There are a number of duvets that we put on and hide under, and I think cynicism is one of those.
I think that's so important, Judith, actually, bringing that up. And it relates to what Elouise was saying about finding a point where, one can start feeling over-responsible for the problem as well, and finding that point that you were talking about where, the work will go on. I can step out of it. That's part of looking after yourself when you need to, and try to find a sense of proportion about responsibility and so on. I think it's vital what you were saying, Judith. Yeah.
May I add a bit to that question as well?
Please, go.
This is more on the ambivalent side of the question. I'm an ecologist and I love a good graph, and that will motivate me. But we've had enough graphs for the past several decades as well, and I think they have convinced everyone who probably could be convinced we have a graph, we need to change, and yeah, the convinced people are convinced, but a lot of people aren't yet and are ambivalent, and they're not motivated by a graph like that. So I think we do need to think of new ways, emotionally intelligent ways of sort of discussing and talking about the climate crisis in more creative ways than we have done in the past, because it's not getting us any further than we are now. I mean, I'm a strong believer that the arts have a good role to play in that, for artists are the best storytellers of all. And if you can get people to write their poems and their songs, make movies, even dances and plays all about the climate crisis, you'll get more and more people motivated and involved and caring, because you are now communicating in a way that they will receive more effectively than necessarily a graph.
Yeah,
I think that's a really important thing to bring in there. And I was certainly thinking as you were speaking about the arts, but really doing anything that connects our hearts with what we're doing will allow us to kind of not harden and freeze into that defensive, cynical position. The ambivalence, we were also asked about ambivalence, Judith. Sally, is there anything you want to add about, we've talked about cynicism a little bit, but what about ambivalence?
do you want to speak, Judith, or should I carry on? No,
And apologies, I keep throwing things at both of you, so
no,
it's probably not very good chairing, but...
So maybe just to say something that I think ambivalence is completely healthy, as long as it's not paralyzing. And if we're able to get hold of those different parts of ourselves that feel differently or want to act differently in relation to a situation, then that's a first step. I think there can be something actually quite unhealthy about persistent single-mindedness. Maybe it's just a thought. Sally.
Yeah, I think it's difficult because we live in a culture where, you know, we're repeatedly told, have a nice day, which I have always great objection to. There are a lot of things I would wish my day to be. Nice is never one of them, but that's the culture that we live in. And also we live in a culture where we're encouraged to believe that we don't have minds. We have what do we have? We have brains, we have DNA things, we have behaviors, you know, anything rather than actually relate to what's going on inside us. We even allowed something called narratives, you know, which sound a bit disembodied, but the idea that we're actually, you know, living, thinking human beings doesn't seem to much come into it. Now, if we deepen the thing and we acknowledge that we are human beings, then I think it becomes very important that we do look at ambivalence, because we not only have a caring side, we have a more destructive side too. We not only want to observe limits, we want to break them. And I mean, more or less individuals and groups will be different in this and so on and so forth. But I think until we actually take that on board and realize that our task is a more difficult one, it's actually getting in touch with ourselves at a deeper level. I'll give you an example of what I mean, if I can, just briefly. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but shall I do this or?
Please do, Sally.
Okay. I went to a conference that basically, climate conference some time ago now, a lot of, you know, very well-known climate people there. And there was a point reached where it was obvious that actually it was possible to have a sustainable world. I mean, technologically. Okay, it was actually possible. And that was at a time when there was a lot of propaganda that it simply wasn't possible. They said it couldn't keep the lights on. We're way past that now. That was all grinding, you know, grinding everybody down. But at that moment, it was very interesting. There was a coffee break, and two people spontaneously said to me, you know, I'm having a reaction I just feel like I'm going to fly all over the world. I don't care anymore. And I couldn't believe my ears. You know, I was, this is what one of them said. This is somebody who's absolutely a stalwart climate person. And then I thought about it some more and I recognized it. It's that when you face a real limit, and something can actually happen and change, something else, the other part of you kicks in. Now, that person didn't go and fly all over the world, but they gave voice to that. Now, I think that's ambivalence. You know, how do we live with those competing sides of ourselves? And how do we, what kind of structures do we need to build in society that helps us to contain our more destructive sides? Because they're there and they're not going anywhere. So I think the subject of ambivalence is a really key one. And the moment we start thinking of ourselves as caring and nothing else, I think we're in deep trouble. So that would be how I would approach it.
I absolutely agree, Sally, and I think that's a really great story. But I want to respond to that, but before I do, can I just encourage people to put questions into the chat for us, please? Because we're picking them up and we've got some great questions coming in, but I'd love to hear from everybody out there who wants to either comment or share an opinion or ask us a question. I mean, I really like what you're saying, Sally, because I think it comes back to something that Judith mentioned, which is this idea that I'm trying to develop at the moment about biodiversity of feeling or biodiversity of emotion, as a way of trying to sort of frame it for people, to give a sort of image of how to allow all of these feelings. So I would be really interested to talk about, you know, what role ambivalence has here and what meaning it carries and why it's useful to us, and what role cynicism has and rage and destructiveness and despair. Because if emotionally, if we try and remove or get rid or disallow or any of these emotional human responses or cognitive responses, for me, it would be the same as, you know, we understand that we need rainforests and we want gorillas and we want insects and we want soil and we want air and water to create biodiversity environmentally, externally. But we also need internal biodiversity. We need emotional biodiversity. And that's much harder for us to sort of allow, I think, and wrap our heads around, partly because they're uncomfortable, these feelings, and partly because, you know, the Western medical model frame says, no, you should not feel these things, or somehow we collectively shame ourselves or shame others. But I want us to talk about how, you know, if ambivalence is the equivalent of a mountain gorilla, why would we want to get rid of it? So that's the way I want to think about this. Elouise, is there anything you want to throw into here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I am an ecologist first, and I think it was kind of a conversation we were having where we came up with sort of biodiversity of feeling. And quick science lesson, the reason why people keep going on about why biodiversity is important is, I try and describe it like a web. Like, imagine biodiversity is a big net or a spider's web with lots of like little nodes in it, and each node is a species or a bit of a variation, a bit of variety. The more nodes and strings and connections you have in an ecosystem, the more resilient it is to perturbations, basically. So when you hear on the news, like, why biodiversity is important, it's mostly that the more varied and diverse an ecosystem is, the more likely it can take a hit and recover. If you don't have many things in an ecosystem, your big net is really holey and patchy and very easy to break and very hard to mend because you haven't got much to work with. So, I mean, I like rewilding, and some of you may have heard of this, but this idea of allowing nature to kind of take back control of itself. And to do that, you often need to add back all the missing parts that have been taken away. And then imagine like you're jump starting a car, which is the ecosystem, and then you don't touch the steering wheel. And the rewilding and the ecosystem just goes the way it wants to go. And I always understood it as kind of feelings or kind of being a similar thing. If you don't have all the feelings, all the range of them, like even things like mosquitoes are feelings, which we don't like, but they have a role and they have a place in that web and need to be there in some degree. If you have more feelings, you also have a stronger web and defense against perturbations, big ones. If you don't have many, it's like a weak net. If you have loads, it's a much stronger, more tightly knitted net. And you may have to deal with the uncomfortable feelings which live in your net, but it makes you stronger as a whole and more resilient as a whole, just like an ecosystem. And so that's kind of how I have muddled my ecology background with this psychology one.
And I'm not sure about muddled, but maybe there's a really nice environmental mix. Chris Robertson's posted a comment about biodiversity of feeling could be multivalence. Multivalence? I'm probably saying it wrong. What about rewilding emotionally, Elouise? Is that something that you would be encouraging us to do?
I think so. I mean, if you consider, again, the metaphors will continue, the UK like a garden, and it's a very well managed garden, and there's a lot of work in rewilding it, because you can manage the ecosystem if you're in small little parcels, but it requires a lot of effort and a lot of management. This is probably similar to saying, like, right, I'm just going to say 3 good things in the morning and make sure I'm happy, and then if any weeds start coming in, like negative thoughts, you like rip them up really quickly and you don't ever let them take a hold. And that's a lot of effort. That's hard work. It's not scalable to a big degree. You can't control it all. You can't control all your feelings like that without getting utterly exhausted and then having a breakdown. By rewilding your emotions, one could say, by allowing all the ugly and beautiful parts to come back, you will be more resilient and you'll be stronger. And I think also, with this kind of frame of mind, appreciate my negative feelings more. Like, I'm happy I have them, in the sense that I myself feel like I am varied and diverse. I am not mentally a little garden where I have to keep all the weeds out and just make sure it's always got sunflowers and poppies, but I can have all the ugly and beautiful parts, and in doing so, that variation is stronger and more beautiful than it would be if it was entirely manicured and superficial. So I do encourage everyone to kind of see the parallels between the world we're trying to save and our own emotions. Judith, do you have something to say or add to that?
Yeah, I think everybody is different, and I think maybe for some of us we don't necessarily allow some of the positive feelings. And I want to come back to Sally visiting the stalks and clearly taking great delight and pleasure in that, and the need for some of us who are very good at the negative emotions to grow our muscles, our emotional muscles, in our capacity to feel joyful gratitude. But maybe there's also some of us who stay in that joyful gratitude place and don't allow deep grief or don't allow the despair. And of course, I'm only naming 3 or 4 emotions here, and there are many varieties in between. So I don't think there's a one size fits all in this biodiversity, the emotions model. What's the emotion that any of us here find the most difficult, and how would it be possible to allow that to live in us and for us to live in it?
I would agree with that, Judith, and I'm also very taken. I'm thinking about this image of the web that's losing its links, you know, because I think one of my areas of thinking is culture, because I think we've been living in a time from the late 80s. I mean, it's actually your lifetime, Elouise. You know, been living through a time where if you take that image of the web, there's been across media, advertising, framing, language, you name it, there's been a rather relentless message to individualize us, to boost self-interest, to rather humiliate our caring parts, you know. And if you think about it in terms of a web, I think it's a good metaphor for, you know, weakening those links. And I'm rather agreeing with what the way Judith was putting it. You know, this culture has actually worked to stop us from grieving. Any sign of grief and you're diverted. You know, where we're meant to stay is sort of a mixture of denial and anger. which are early stages of grieving. We're never to reach the actual, that's the culture, that's the have a nice day, So I think that we are in a state of cultural devastation, a loss of diversity, and I love your image of the links that have been broken. So partly I think we need to recognize the boosting of our destructive side, and as Judith was pointing out, the relative underplaying of our caring parts, which I think have been actually much more to the fore during COVID. I think something's really happened during COVID where people have seen the importance of care. Everything's been stripped to the bone, and suddenly, we see what really matters, and what really matters is people looking after each other and valuing carers and so on. There's been quite a shift, but so I like your image, and it's complex. I think we do need to put the cultural frame around it as well.
Yes, absolutely. And we've got a number of points and comments and questions coming in that fit with that, Sally, very strongly. So we've got a comment from Chris Robertson saying, are we focusing on individual action? And a reminder that ecology is more than individuals, that this is, including the other than human. There's also a direct question about non-native species, and I think these are interconnected really, about people's negative feelings towards the other and towards non-native species, whether they are non-native species of plants or animals, or I'm thinking as well about climate migrants and the kind of desire to kind of push away people that we perceive as somehow threatening the alleged native culture. And then there's also a really interesting comment here from Amanda about controlling rather than allowing and relating, and about the kind of reaction, the kind of heroic reaction to try and control this whole process, which of course goes against all of that. And Jamie's also made a really interesting comment about learning from other cultures, and particularly about emotional connection. And I think Judith maybe talks about ritualizing. So I've just wanted to kind of summarize a few of those points and questions that are coming in. Judith, Sally, Elouise, have any of you got any comments of those things you particularly would like to pick up on?
Well, I think certainly just to say that both the questions about learning from other cultures is, there is this arrogance that we know best about how to manage these feelings. There can be a kind of Britishness about that, superiority. And we have a great deal to learn. And so I'm really grateful for the two posts that respect that and bring our attention to the fact we have so much to learn. And here we are, not a very diverse audience. And
may I add to that? I completely agree that, talking of the UK particularly, we're not very good at seeing the importance and the wisdom in cultures other than ourselves. We have a history of often thinking we are the best. But particularly in the climate crisis and this existential crisis, there have been so many other communities who have experienced such dramatic world shifts, such negative, sort of terrible events, and we can learn so much from them by how they managed to survive it against all odds, whether it's from extreme racism or colonialism. A lot of people have felt grief and anger and sadness about the destruction of their worlds, and we can learn from their wisdom, and we can collectively heal those past things as well as trying to heal the planet that we have now.
Thank you, Elouise. I wonder if could I move us towards including empathy and compassion in this conversation, because we've got 10 minutes to go, and I was wondering about, we've been touching on the edge of the destruction. Connection has been mentioned repeatedly. Could we move into empathy? And the role of empathy, the role of compassion.
Have you got something to add there, Caroline? Because you wanted to bring it in.
Yes, sure, I can do. I think for myself, I would come back to certainly a lot of the children that I've spoken with about how they feel about the climate and biodiversity crisis, and the emphasis that they place on the way in which they frame caring or connect with caring is empathy, direct empathy with the plight of animals and the plight of the environment, and how personally it's felt. That this isn't happening to the other, this isn't happening to someone else, this is happening to them. I mean, we teach children and young people about relationships and about caring by buying picture books with bunny rabbits and, you know, puppies and kittens. It's how we primarily teach children and young people about relationship and about caring. And then I think we find somehow that we need to kind of reduce that care as we move into adulthood. And I know I'm generalizing, and I know that's dissatisfactory, and I do apologize. But there's just something about that profound personal empathy and the non-differentiation between self and other, between self and the animals, self and the environment, that I think is still held and embodied in a lot of children. That somehow we need to be finding a way to listen to the wisdom of that. It's also connected perhaps to the sort of the economic systems that we've been talking about, because we are talking about this as a systemic problem, not an individual problem, and about the way systemically we economically only place value on trees because of what they are worth economically, as opposed to their kind of living, breathing value spiritually, soulfully, emotionally, and physically and beautifully of being in the world. And that somehow we lose that magic, and in fact we even call it magic as a way of calling it less important. So for me, if I was being asked to speak about empathy, that's what I would say, is that it's about sort of allowing ourselves to remember that direct connection. So that's what I would want to add in there.
I think you're talking about what happens when our empathy, when we're told that our empathy doesn't really matter. And I think what you're referring to is the way that we're encouraged to fracture our world so that we see ourselves as above animals. And within that, we see some humans as above other humans, and so on and so forth. But you're bringing in the animals, and I think that's really important. So that it seems to me that the first step towards empathy is greater empathy. Is you can't be empathic when you're in that fractured state, because you've already located the other somewhere else that doesn't touch you, because you are superior to that other. So I think it's bound up with fracturing. But if one's talking about actually forming links, I completely agree with you. And I think children, we've got an awful lot to learn from children and from, you know, the child inside ourselves. I mean, I'll give you an example. I hesitate to give it because it's sort of personal, and it's, you know, I'm not putting myself forward in some way, because it's to do with becoming a vegan. That's what I mean. I'm not trying to put forward the advantage of becoming a vegan or something. But what I have noticed is, since I've become a vegan, which has been about 18 months or 2 years, I've lost track of time, from a vegetarian and from a meat eater before then, long before then, it's actually really changed me. Now, I mean, in sort of, actually the action has changed me, so that I've got to the stage when wasn't planning for this to happen. It just happened, where I can look at meat on a plate or something and I don't see a chop or a thing, I actually see a part of a dead animal. And it's quite disturbing. I wasn't looking for that, you know. But what I did notice is that after I took that step, I remembered right back to when I was about 5 on my grandparents' farm in South Africa, and it was a dairy farm. And I made an immediate connection with myself, which was, yes, you always knew from then that what was happening to the calves was not a good idea. You were always upset about the calves, weren't you? And it was like I'd forgotten that part of myself all those years before. Now, I'm not putting forward this as any sort of advice to anybody else. I'm just describing what happened to me with change, and how, you know, I also regained some empathy and connection with a child in myself who had felt that way at the time, and I had completely sidelined that. So I think it's really changed how I see animals. And I feel I can kind of look them more in the eye somehow, you know. Anyway, that's my response.
Yeah. As you were speaking, Sally, I could see a calf's eye in my mind looking back. Maybe it's us as you were speaking. We have a few minutes. I'm sorry, of course, there's never enough time in these conversations. We have recorded this and we will be making it available afterwards. And there's loads of other links and resources to Sally's work and to Elouise's work and the Climate Psychology Alliance website. So do go and have a rummage about. It's all open access. We'd love to hear from anybody who's not been able to join in the conversation today. But thank you for joining us. Any last comment, thoughts, words, Judith, Elouise, Sally? Anything you want to end with?
Yeah, I'd like to just come in with a comment Jo has made in the chat on actually real down-to-earth empathy, and she says she works encouraging lobbying with. She's a climate lobbyist for MPs. And practicing empathy has been the most powerful way to encourage them to begin to listen deeply to their constituents on this issue. Empathy allows us as campaigners to find out what the hopes, dreams and fears of the MP is, and to frame climate change around that. And I was just thinking when she said that, what jolly hard work that is, you know, and you know, and I think we all have those places in ourselves where we really need to grow an empathy muscle. And it may be for the other than human, or it may be for people who we might even despise or be contemptuous of. And I think that's such an important, I'm really glad you brought in that practical application of empathy, Jo. Thank you.
Yes, thank you as well. And it makes me, what I want to say is that I feel particularly frustrated today with not being able to see everybody, not being able to actually directly engage with, because we've got a lot of wisdom in this group, you know, and there's so much behind each of those comments in the chat. So I'm really sorry about that, you know, but it's the real world and this is what we have at the moment. But thank you very much, everybody. And yeah.
Thank you, Elouise.
No real ending comments. I don't think I could say what Judith and Sally said any better, but just remember that there is so much more that connects us than necessarily divides us, and we really need to find all those links if we are going to make the changes that we so need to make across the entirety of the world.
Absolutely. And I would also want to just bring in a sort of final comment, not from me, but from some of the children I've been listening to over the last few years, and about the importance of us being able to sort of bridge some of these gaps with imaginal movement, imaginal leaps. And the children in the Maldives said to me, you know, they saw online that people in Iceland had a funeral for a glacier, which was a beautiful ritual. And they said, but, you know, who cares? Who's going to have a funeral for us in the Maldives? So I think what we've been trying to explore today is the importance of keeping in mind and keeping in our hearts the need to do that, and the need to keep that imaginal love and care and empathy globally. So it's 3 o'clock. We're going to have to pull this to a close, but the recording will be made available. And thank you everyone for coming. And
can I just ask, how do we get the chat? Because I'd like to read the chat and I haven't. Is there any way to?
We can save it.
Thank you. Thank you.
We will save the chat. Judith, you'll save the chat, won't you? Because you've got, it's on your Zoom. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Excellent, excellent metaphors. I loved all the metaphors.
Thank you, Dave.
You.
I'm working on one as I'll send it to you. It's called the stress bucket metaphor that I've used for a few years, but I'm adapting it to climate and eco-anxiety based on the discussion we've just had.
Do send it. We'd love to see it.
Where do I send it to?
You can send it to the Climate Psychology Alliance.
Admin. There's an admin.
Admin.
Yeah.
Okay. That was really stimulating. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you.
Recommended by my friend Maggie Turp, who's one of your
Okay.
organisation. Thank you so much. It was brilliant. Very good for Extinction Rebellion.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for joining us.
Are you able to save the chat, Judith? Have you got?
I have saved that, indeed.
You've saved the chat. Marvellous.
I have.
And you recorded it, so we can.
Recorded it. So let me stop the recording.